It says, "Hey Wes, what is the moral argument for the existence of God, and how do you explain that?" So let me start by saying that there are multiple iterations of what we refer to as the moral argument. And the one that I think I would subscribe to consists of getting to a necessary rational source. So basically, what I'm going to do is be articulating something that comes from an individual named Linda Zagzowski in a work called Does Ethics Need God? I'm just going to be parroting a lot of that. And basically, the breakdown of it is that if objective moral facts exist, they need to find an origination for their existence. And if they do exist, the question then follows, where do they come from? So let me try to break this down in a way that is hopefully more understandable. And if it's still too convoluted by the time I get to the end of this, feel free to basically ignore this section. Tune out for a little bit until I get to your question. First, morality is a rational enterprise, and it's explored within the confines of rational thought. And what I mean by that is that moral facts can be discovered through basic rationality and reasoning. Now, this goes equally for things like mathematics or philosophical reasoning as well. So, for example, if you see, you know what, don't worry about that. Let me just keep going. So, secondly, moral realism is true in that moral facts exist. And third, moral problems and disagreements among humans are too many, depending on where you are and what century it is and where you find yourself, that sort of thing, that people disagree on all sort of ethical conclusions. And those disparities are too much to conclude that morality can be grounded simply in human rationality. So to parse that out a bit, what's meant by that is that humans cannot be the source of moral knowledge because we're not perfect and cannot have perfect knowledge of all the facts in question. In other words, humans are flawed, and therefore grounding moral knowledge in ourselves as the foundation will always lead to issues. I mean, history is full of examples of humans constantly failing to grasp moral facts and incorrectly and inappropriately performing moral duties. I think we can all agree on that. We're also contingent beings, and much like how the laws of logic or mathematics aren't grounded in a human source, the reality of morality, I like that, the reality of morality cannot be grounded in a human source. Now, these are things we discover, not create. So if morality is a rational enterprise and moral realism is true, then it logically follows that moral problems and disagreements among humans are too much for us to assume moral facts and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality. In other words, if moral facts and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source, following from the reality that the truth of moral realism, then there needs to be a necessary source for those things to be grounded in. And that logically flows, or follows, I guess. What logically follows that is the source is what we call God. And in order for that source to be rational, it must be sentient in nature. So non-sentient objects cannot be rational. And therefore, the moral law giver is God. So to slow it down and back up, if moral realism is true, morality exists. And it exists whether I'm here or not. When I die, murder doesn't stop being morally wrong for me. It just still goes on being morally wrong outside of my personal experience and existence. If that's true, then there are moral prescriptions and obligations that are rational and discussed, understood, and obeyed by rational sentient agents, i.e. you and me. Then it is logically impossible for them to be grounded in a natural source. So when a Christian says that morals find their foundation in the character of God, we're not just arbitrarily stating that fact. That conclusion comes from what would necessarily follow from the actuality of moral realism. God is the necessary rational source. So the Christian, understanding philosophy for what we call the moral argument is both grounding for the objective good and bad, as well as making an argument that there needs to be a necessary rational source for said standards to begin with, and is therefore a coherent argument for the existence of God itself. So actually, let me just pull up a couple quotes here. This is one taken from my presentation on the problem of evil. So this one I use, and it's a quote from a guy named Michael Ruse, who's actually a fellow Canadian, but he's currently the professor of philosophy at Florida State University. And in an article that he wrote in 2010, he said this. He said, morality is just a matter of emotions, like liking ice cream and sex and hating toothaches and marking students' papers. But it is and has to be a funny kind of emotion. It has to pretend that it is not that at all. If we thought that morality was no more than liking or not liking spinach, then pretty quickly it would break down. So, morality has to come across as something that is more than emotion. It has to appear to be objective, even though in reality it is subjective. So in other words, Ruse is acknowledging that moral realism sure looks like it's true. But even though it looks like it's true, even though all the evidence points to it being true, the implications of acting like it's not true are too problematic. So despite all the rationality and sensibility of moral realism, we need to pretend like it's true, even though we think it's not. It's kind of like Richard Dawkins. He was talking with Steven Weinberg at an event in Texas, and he said that the universe appears to be fine-tuned, but because we know that it's not fine-tuned, we can dismiss that as just the appearance of such. And Michael Ruse is doing a similar thing with morality. Also, it's probably important for me to point out that what I'm not saying is because sometimes when we talk about morality only being able to be grounded in God, atheists get mad because they think we're saying that non-theists can't be good people. But that's what we're not saying. So here's what we're not saying. Of course, atheists can do good things and lead good lives. The question is one of foundation and logical grounding. Glenn Scribner, who works for a ministry organization called Speak Life, he has this great example where he says if someone is asking where they got their morality from, it's like asking where they got their pants from. They're not saying they don't have any pants. They just want to know where the root of the location as to where those pants came from is. So the moral argument is addressing the question of the foundational moral duties and facts. Foundation of those moral duties and facts. In fact, if moral realism is true, then you would expect there to be moral atheists, because moral realities exist outside of ourselves because they are objective. They exist outside of us. They're not subjective. And even the objection that you can account for moral facts evolutionarily doesn't even remotely answer the grounding question. So at that point, all that would explain is how we as the human species understand and know moral facts, or came to understand and know moral facts. But that's not a rational explanation as to where they're coming from, how they're accounted for. That is the difference between what's referred to as epistemology, which is the study of how we come to know what we know, and ontology, which is the study of the nature of something. In other words, in an explanation for how we as a species learned moral facts and duties doesn't explain the foundation for them. And I would contend that the only logically consistent ontology of morality is the fact that A, morality is a rational enterprise, B, moral realism is true, C, the moral problems and disagreements among humans are too much for us to assume moral facts and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality. D, moral facts and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source. And E, that source is what we call God. So, what the moral argument for Christians points out is that moral subjectivity in any way starts to break down really quickly without a necessary, rational source outside of the natural world. So, I know that may have been a little complicated, and I definitely got into the weeds there, but I think it's important that we understand not only that morality is grounded in the essence and character of God, but why that is.